Well now, a huge welcome to you to my channel, The Magic of Java. This is my fourth book in the series, and this is called The Phoenix and the Creatures of Darkness. Now I want to emphasise that this is a novel, and only a novel. Yes, it is based on real people, even some celebrities, and real events. But I need to apologise to you if you feel you've identified yourself, because that was never my intention. The intention is for this simply to be a novel, an entertainment for you. Removing the scales. Widati and her boyfriend came to visit us. Whilst lovely to see her, it exposed the huge uncertainties and lack of security which has engulfed us all. Weedy lost her job as a result of the health crisis and is now reliant on me to send her money, with no end in sight. That Widati has struggled to find work and was the first to lose her job says so much about Indonesia and the world in general. Widati is a very creative multimedia designer who came top of her class at Indonesia's best and most expensive art school. But critically, neither I nor her mother have any real contacts in Indonesia and cannot assist her in pursuing a career. Now, the problem with Widati's damaged leg from a road accident many years ago looks to be becoming critical, but Widati is insisting on being treated at the most expensive hospital in Indonesia, which would require Maddie and I relocating to Jakarta to look after her for at least 6 months, all of which looks neither possible nor practical. Whilst during the health crisis is probably a good time for her surgery, I could not afford this if we were to sell the house in Jakarta and buy a cheaper one, or at least know that this could be achieved quickly when needed. But the property market in Jakarta has collapsed, and whilst never efficient, it is probably now impossible to sell our home. Not that we've done anything about it. Actually, there really isn't a housing market in Indonesia, even in Jakarta. Homes are sold by the square metre, based on the rateable value of the land. Everybody attempts to achieve an excess on this rateable value, regardless of the condition of the home. But this can only be realised if the area has become more desirable, or the home is in excellent condition with many improvements. In the main, homes remain unsold because no one will offer more than the land value, with once prestige homes falling into disrepair, a speedy process in the tropics, until they are certainly not worth a premium, and the only realistic option is redevelopment. Without surgery, Widati may be crippled, but there is only a limited chance that the surgery will be effective. Hence her insistence on the most expensive hospital in Indonesia. To break the ice with Widati's boyfriend, I suggested that we open a bottle of whiskey, something I've not drunk in many years, and am now largely teetotal. Whilst I quite enjoyed the whiskey, it made me tired, and I was soon in bed. The next morning reminding me of why I really should not drink whiskey anymore, and those sad times when I drank myself to sleep every night in Manchester. But during the night a loud crash came from inside my wardrobe. Maddie tried to wake me, but I was sound asleep. Thus Maddie contacted Parcano, who explained that it was an energy clash, as people had once again targeted us with black magic, but that Parcano was protecting our house, and that she should not worry, although to throw some salt at the wardrobe in the morning, which she did. This seemed to make sense to me, not least as I could feel a somewhat different attack, only a week after the man from Banton, who I had felt to be working against us with Uni, had attempted to make contact with me again. But when eventually I got up and opened the wardrobe, I found that the clothing rail had broken, sending it crashing down. I spent the whole of the next morning making emergency repairs with a hangover, which will teach me not to drink whiskey. Well, we have been having recurring problems with our well and water pump in Jakarta, and once again it broke. On investigation, this time it was found to be the actual well pump rather than the distribution pump. The workman sent us a picture of the top of the well with a shroud over it, covered in blood. This seemed to make sense to both Maddie and I, who have for long suspected that the focus of the black magic was our water supply. So when the workman explained that it was simply a white plastic cover and the blood was recent from having cut himself exposing the well, we once again laughed at how paranoia had taken over our thinking. The whole episode of Widati's visit really being a microcosm of the themes that have dominated our lives for so long. We have been presented with problems we seemingly cannot resolve, yet are expected to come up with a solution. We are still scarred by the black magic of attacks that we are still unable to lead a normal life, let alone move back to Jakarta, despite all but me really wanting this to happen. Almost all who we know, have taken from us and taken again, under the assumption that my wealth was limitless. But those who still owe me money will make no greater attempt to repay me, just because of our dilemma, and will blame external circumstances like the health crisis for their inability to come to my assistance, as though I, and more importantly, Widati, should bear the cost of the health crisis. Yes, I'm surrounded by children, unable and unwilling to accept any responsibility for their actions and commitments. And that has been the lesson that has been playing in and out of my life for so long. Can I simply accept that this is how life is, without being drawn into blaming everything onto external circumstances myself? But then how can I condemn my stepdaughter to becoming a cripple? No parent can, except perhaps one who has already accepted that there is little more that he can do for his schizophrenic son, and as a result has lost contact with him. But these family dilemmas are being played out the world over. We've all paid taxes in the belief that these provided us with an insurance should we experience circumstances like these. We've all believed that governments have seen full employment as a goal, and if not always effective in achieving this, at least we could anticipate spending most of our lives earning money. All these beliefs are now being challenged and attacked, and with them the family unit. Despite my concerns about collection of my debts, I realised that if I were to collect just a quarter of what I am owed, my problems would be resolved. I thus set about letting those who owed me money that I needed repaying to save my stepdaughter's mobility. The initial reaction was as I had anticipated from all but one of my debtors, realising this was actually them stating to me that they are more important than me and my children, I resolved not to let them off the hook so easily. But of course, such some circumstances to sort out who are your real friends and who are friendly simply for what they can get. Another microcosm of what is happening in the wider world. I spoke to my mother shortly afterwards, who delighted in exposing my stupidity in having loaned people money, and ended with the encouraging message that I would never see any of this money again. Looking back, my ex-partner had often told me the same. I guess psychopaths and narcissists are so much less trusting because they're actually aware of how devious people can be. Certainly for both, every interaction is a power relationship, so every interaction is treated with suspicion. This also means that exposing my stupidity is yet another opportunity to exert their power over me. After all, my problems are an excellent opportunity to become their dramas. Does this represent their right brain when they always seem to be so dominated by their left? Certainly neither my father nor I could keep up with my mother's right brain logic, or lack of it as we saw it. That she would contradict herself within the same sentence disturbed me and my father, but my mother has always said exactly what came into her head the moment that it appears there. My mother's comments were a trigger for me to swear at my mother. I know I shouldn't, but she really does know how to upset me and delights in doing so. In fact, annoying me is probably the only thing keeping my mother alive. Her normal tactic is to get me to disclose something by pretending to be concerned, then to play it back to me with an even more pessimistic twist to it. My anger confirming that I am indeed codependent upon her. But her prediction wasn't completely true, and some people did rally to help us, and nothing like as much as I was owed to us. But these little gestures lifted my spirits immensely. Lifted my spirits, yes, but not enough to prevent a major paranormal attack, which left me with chronic hiccups and the feeling of being completely bloated. Such interactions are typical of the narcissist and their victim. My mother's always delighted at making me lose my temper in front of others, in front of my father, in front of my partners, including Maddie. Of course, my licensed psychopathic partner delighted in perpetuating the image of me as being short-tempered. Indeed, my partner would scream at me to stop shouting, when it was her who'd first raised her voice, despite completely denying it. Often the trigger is a blatant lie that the truth seeker within me cannot let go unnoticed. This is normally accompanied with some gaslighting in an attempt to convince me that it is really I who have an uncontrollable temper, which results in violent actions. But worse than me losing my temper was when I broke down in a fit of tears, completely unable to deal with the situation any further, knowing that I was being manipulated, but having no behaviours within my armour to deal with it. Not least as most of my behaviour had been learned from my narcissistic mother. When I broke down, my mother and ex-partner would delight in telling me to pull myself together, delighting in their power over me. Certainly the phrase, "Please try to control your temper," is a firm indication you're being manipulated. I guess we all annoy young children to the point that they lose their temper. Certainly I've seen Maddie doing this with Yanni's son. But the objective is to teach children about control And the ending always results in a big hug, not a telling off. However, can my mother still justify pushing me to the point of losing my temper when I'm over 60? No, she's relishing in the control she has over me. Control that she has abused since I was a young child. Such interactions might be the precursor to convincing family, friends and health professionals that the victim has some sort of mental health disorder. Certainly my mother is paranoid about finding herself in a mental health institution, and many of her apparent physical ailments appear to be an attempt to offset her mental health problems, albeit that she fails to realise that these are simply personality traits. But is her delight in making me lose my temper also an attempt to make others believe that it is I who am mentally ill-adjusted and not her? Unfortunately, even when I point this out to others, all they can see is me losing my temper and not the provocation. Such is the devious nature of manipulation and my awareness of their subtlety. But being an empath, this is a trap to which I fall into every time. Even when I know that I must resist, this only reinforces the constructed image of me. But the most destructive impact is that it has on human nature, as I have done with the realisation that I used to have in Martin. Indeed, such weakness is the sign that to the narcissist and psychopaths are to inflict mortal blows. Is this the role of the narcissist and the psychopath? To destroy the bonds that God gave to all humans, and indeed to all his or her creation, in doing so to take humanity further away from God. These interventions were also the cue to accuse me of losing my mind, something that my ex-partner had done so effectively to Branwell that he really did. An accusation which is repeated and repeated, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that I am a drama queen, while my mother and ex-partner were calm and compassionate. Indeed, such losses of composure are indicative of the trauma which comes from psychopathic abuse and may continue for many, many years after this abuse ends. We are told that setting boundaries is the way to deal with such situations, but clearly such advice does not come from somebody who has lived with a psychopath, as a boundary is a red rag to a bull, stamping all over this boundary, aggressively berating me for daring to believe that I have the right to emotional solitude. Indeed, when I tried to escape my ex-partner's abuse, she would physically back me into corners, as though her strategy was to get me to hit her, so that she could claim that she was the one who was abused. A strategy which, as far as I can tell, worked with my son Branwell, as she delighted in showing minor bruises to anyone who would show concern. Looking back on my life, and especially my time with my ex-partner, I recall how I was always listening to the advice of psychologists, but everything I did failed. It was probably that knowledge that nothing I did seemed to protect me that caused me to sink into the deep despair that I eventually succumbed to. But I must also realise that this despair led me to ultimately rejecting my partner, and moving to Indonesia was the perfect way to establish no contact, the perfect boundary of 12,000 kilometres. Or is it? But I think the true lasting harm was that my reaction had convinced me that I was emotionally immature. I wish I'd realised much earlier in my life that almost every conversation my mother and ex-partner, and now I must regrettably conclude my son, has with me is designed to either gather information to make me lose my temper or to make me actually lose my temper. With this knowledge, I do hope I can now resist the provocation, but also understand that the more I resist the provocation, it will become, which is all too apparent within Branwell. Indeed, I always lose my temper with my mother on day 4 of my visit to her, because during the first 2 days she's gathering the ammunition, and then when I've been subjected to 2 days of provocation prior to exploding. My mother probably knows that I can bottle up my temper for those 2 days, and knows the exact time she will get a reward for provoking me. Indeed, I will have let her know many times that she's overstepping my boundaries, but these are more of a challenge than a restriction to her. The same has been true in business. I had believed that I could read situations well, but just occasionally I don't, and they go very wrong. Nothing could be further from the truth. When things don't go well, it's because there is an attempt to manipulate me, which, to the annoyance of the manipulators, I am resisting their control. This also explains why business has become more and more problematic and less enjoyable, because of the level of manipulation has been increasing dramatically. Indeed, the more I resisted the control, the more frequent were the character assassinations which contributed to my decline into despair. I recall how Oscar had convinced me that I lacked diplomacy when I held back on him, offering what we could not deliver on in Vietnam. Ultimately, these attacks stymied me. This reflects both the degree to which a number of narcissists within the general population has increased, but also to the degree to which psychopathy has become ingrained within the workings of our institutions. From now on, I must resist the temptation to lose my temper, or even become agitated, but to understand that these feelings signal that I'm being manipulated. There is probably no way to outsmart the narcissist or psychopath, as they are determined, like our adversaries, using black magic. And like our adversaries using black magic, we need to keep calm and stop rising to the provocations. Indeed, the emotional violence experienced by both Branwell and I began to get out of hand, with Branwell ultimately being given a restraining order by magistrates. As who would believe a hysterical teenager over his calm and seemingly concerned mother? This leads the victim to internalise the view that there's no way out and that the whole world is against them. Could this be the real reason for Branwell's schizophrenia? Maybe, or maybe I'm seeking an explanation for what cannot be fully explained. Certainly narcissists' abuse can be a trigger for the not unrelated trait of schizoid personality disorder, as an attempt to regulate the emotions. Is it also a potential source of high-band autism, which has been hypothesised that Branwell suffers from, and that his seemingly unwillingness to enter the adult world, neoteny? Branwell was pushed and encouraged by his mother to overachieve. Despite in my heart feeling it was wrong, Branwell seemed to respond well, and this improved his confidence. Needless to say, it was me who was painted as the pushy parent, when I was simply proud. Not a good emotion, but honest. Of course, Branwell and my relationship was a source of jealousy, just as mine and his father's had been, and my father's had been. But I was pushed away from Branwell. I had no idea that it was robbing him of his childhood, and in doing so his inability to become an adult. Forcing a child into adult pursuits is one of the subtlest varieties of soul murder. Very often we find that the narcissist was deprived of his childhood. Consider the gifted child, the wunderkind, the answer to his mother's prayers, and to solve her frustrations. The wunderkind narcissist refuses to grow up. In his mind, his tender age formed an integral part of the precious miracle that he once was. One looks much less phenomenal, as one's exploits and achievements are much less inspiring at the age of 60 than the age of 4. Better stay young forever and secure an interminable string of narcissist supplier. So the narcissist abjures all adult skills chores. He never takes out a driver's license. He does not have children. He rarely has sex. He never settles down in one place. He rejects intimacy. In short, he renounces adulthood. Adult skills he assumes, no adult responsibility. He expects indulgence from others. Sam Vaskin, Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revealed. This explains everything about Branwell's current inability to function. He was completely slowed down in his development and broken down mentally. I must still accept that I should have done more to support him. It also highlights why I found it so difficult to do so. Poor Branwell, his mother insisted on him going to Manchester Grammar School, when I felt he might have been better off learning life skills at the local comprehensive. Reflecting on things, Branwell has very low levels of conscientiousness and commitment. I remember him begging me to buy him a French course. I only agreed as he promised to complete it, as I knew he was, but he didn't, and he claims my lack of sanctions made him realise that he could get away with such things. This really will make it so hard for him in the competitive world. But what I hadn't really registered with me was how incapable he was in all those little things which turn a child into a functioning adult. Of course, the state has washed their hands of Branwell, for what can you do with a well-educated, intelligent adult with the skills and emotions of a child? The other great worry I have for Branwell's future is, could he be prone to violence, even though this has been provoked by his mother? Maybe he does exhibit excessive anger. I'm not too sure, for this would be enough to ensure he never achieves whatever else may be holding him back, at least his intelligence, and a good, if compulsive, liar, so therefore will probably avoid spending his life incarcerated. It's clear to me that Branwell was used to keep me in control, and whilst I always believed Branwell played me off against his mother, I had no idea that he was being played to get at me. Indeed, the very reason why his mother was so keen to have a child was to bind me to her for life. When he was 6, I recall how she taught him to repeat anal retentive at me whenever I tried to teach him life skills. The reason I remained in an abusive relationship for so long was that subconsciously I was trying to protect Branwell without really knowing what from. I promised myself to stay with him until he went to university, but this was delayed for a year as he conveniently resat his A-levels. I had no idea that him welcoming this was a warning sign that he was holding on to his childhood. If Branwell was used to make me to commit to his mother, it worked only too well, and encouraging him to take his A-levels, squoze another year out of me. Then when he did eventually go to university and I had left to marry Maddie, he was with his mother for Christmas holidays when he had his psychotic episode, which I assume is schizophrenia. Could all of these be indicative of his manipulations? That his trauma was developed and triggered, as my temper outbursts have been, by my own mother? I now even question, did my partner really want a child, or was it just to control me and a useful secondary source of abuse? It's dark, isn't it? But believe me, psychopaths are terribly dark. Branwell's mother seemed to goad and push me to become violent towards her. And in Branwell's case, this ultimately worked. This included physically cornering me so I could not avoid her, and some minor physical abuse. But I'm willing to believe that Branwell, it was more serious. After all, from an early age she had hit him. I assumed that this was so that she could play the victim and accuse us of mental instability. Indeed, Branwell insisted that her injuries were self-inflicted, simply to blame him. I'm sure that this is the correct interpretation, but of course getting someone to hit you is just another form of control, an extension of getting someone to lose their temper. The result being that Branwell has a restraining order and a criminal record. Maybe he deserves this, but even if he does, he's been manipulated into it. His life destroyed by his own mother, and there has been absolutely nothing I could do, even had I known the truth at the time. Until my father's death, I believed that he too had colluded with my mother, especially as she used him to fire his bullets. She would always get my father to say the most hurtful things she really wanted to say, such as Maddie was only after me for my money. Then there was the time when I told my mother that I had a Jamaican girlfriend. I was woken by her beating and screaming, "Your father says it must be like kissing a gorilla." Well, it was the 1970s. But now it's all too apparent that my father was a victim of my mother's gaslighting. I also remember many minor disagreements with my father, which I now realise that he was set up to create, as I'm sure my ex-partner did with Branwell and I. Once I recall, during our weekly phone calls, my father would tell me off if I didn't immediately inquire about their health. A very typical narcissistic Hoover, as indeed is the weekly phone call. But perhaps the most telling was the frequent threat to remove me from the will, which my mother still does, on the dubious pretext that being in Indonesia, she cannot be sure that I will receive it anyway. Indeed, this is related to what an ungrateful child I was constantly told that I was, backed up by threats to give away all my toys to starving children in Africa. Yes, my father, whom everyone saw as a compassionate man, was actually dominated and downtrodden by my mother, and that is why he almost always sided with her against me, even when it was apparent that I was a victim. Indeed, he is almost certainly a fellow empath, and as an empath, like me, he is addicted to narcissists, always seeing the best in my mother and believing that he could change her. Yes, my father just accepted his role with my mother, hardly ever challenging her will and willing to accept that the problems were his creation, or at least partially. But then, like me, he saw the best in everyone and would constantly tell me what a good, loving wife my mother was. as though he was trying to convince himself that he could change her. Of course, he kept loving and forgiving my mother, because that is what an empath does. I remember a game of cheat, and my partner commented that my father was so bad at lying, as lying and manipulation were not natural to him. It always urged me to calm down, even when I was clearly unable to cope with the situation, not realising that he was actually asking me to accept becoming a bit player for my mother's narcissism, as he had. I do, however, remember my father placing a copy of Rudyard Kipling's If next to my childhood bedside. Was this a subconscious wish that I should rise above it? If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowances for their doubting too, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about but don't deal in lies, or being hated and don't give way to hating, and yet don't look back nor talk too wise. My father has always tried to convince me that everything was normal at home and that there was nothing strange about my mother. So I had internally believed that I was responsible for the tensions and problems within my childhood home. I took these feelings into my relationship with my psychopathic ex-partner. On reflections, I have always brought with me some narcissistic behaviour and learned responses to narcissistic behaviour. This is the real reason why I failed to spot there was something very wrong with my relationship. You see, the only relationships I knew were narcissistic, and I believed these to be normal. But worse still, that I had failed to protect Branwell until it was far too late, and by then impossible. It's quite normal for a victim to only realise that a parent is a narcissist after suffering the abuse of a narcissistic partner. So I am following a well-trodden pattern. I also recall how I wasted so many years with my partner, trying to prove that she was lying to me and that I didn't keep being mistaken. I used to describe it as rewriting history, her rewriting of history. I never said that, as it was done with such conviction. Something I knew only too well from my own mother. But the reaction was, of course, is the wrong thing to do with a narcissist or psychopath, when all I should have done is let her know that I'd sussed a game and didn't want to play. But no, to an IFJ, I wanted her to love me, which she could never do, nor can. Eventually I did let my partner know that I'd sussed a game, but when she had already resolved that it was over. Yanni's son is growing up fast, and no longer the total handful he was just a few months ago. Indeed, he adores Maddie, spending as much time with her as possible, and unlike his mother, obeying Maddie. Maddie explained to me that she had once, and only once, chastised him, and he'd not put a foot wrong ever since. One day I witnessed him having a temper tantrum, and like all temper tantrums, there was no way of stopping it without shocking him. As Yanni took him home for his shock, Maddie explained to me that he'd accused his mother of being naughty and wanted to be with his father, who still works away in Jakarta. I was also reminded of how Branwell had occasionally had such tantrums, and also seemed to blame his mother for something which seemed insignificant, but not to him. This led me to consider if such tantrums are based on a deep sense of injustice, that as the young brain develops, it begins to develop a sense of what is right and wrong. But when adults are seen to be breaking this code, a tantrum is the only recourse. I'm far too old to remember my own temper tantrums, but I suspect they're not unlike how I now lose my temper with my mother. Is that it? Does my mother know that by displaying irrational moral behaviour, it will provoke a loss of my composure? Is that also how my partner controlled me? I certainly remember my huge sense of injustice when she attempted to convince me that something which was blatantly untrue was true. Might this not only explain Branwell's tantrums, but his schizophrenic rages? It was after writing this that I realised that the tantrum and rage were nothing compared with the sense of victimhood a narcissist leaves you with. Those who've been a victim of a narcissist are left with a feeling of injustice and fatalism, which becomes self-fulfilling throughout their lives, including entering relationships with psychopaths. So having raised my vibration from the despair of 3 years ago, I now realise that I have a mission to raise it some more. I now need to manifest and use my will, not to the detriment of others, but in the knowledge that I deserve it. To a degree, I have been programmed by my mother and ex-partner, but also that the psychopathic assumptions imposed on human relationships, that my gain is always another's loss, a paradigm I must release myself from. This is what growing up for a child of this is what growing up is for the child of a narcissist. What you resist persists. Carl Jung. Whilst I still refuse to believe that my mother is so malicious, I must accept that I cannot trust anything she says. All too often, conversation is simply an opportunity to reinforce her agenda. Like Yanni's son, from a young age, I had a sense of injustice when I discovered that my mother lied to me, but also respected her instincts. But I must come to terms with the realisation that truth is an abstract concept to my mother, something she bends at whim to fit in with her will. Like all narcissists, her lies will be blended with truth, which makes it so impossible to navigate through what I can trust. The same is true about what I can believe to be my character, as I now realise that my self-image has been so manipulated by my mother and then my ex-partner. From this day, I must follow my feelings and not the beliefs that have been passed on to me by others. The parallels with all that is happening in the world now is uncanny. It's obvious that our governments are lying to us about the health crisis and that they keep repeating these lies even when they're found out. Indeed, the mainstream media are colluding with the deceit by not covering any of the opposition or alternative opinions. Many politicians are now openly corrupt and ignoring their own health restrictions, whilst law enforcement seems intent on destroying the public's consent, almost goading them into civil unrest. Thus, the elite of psychopaths and narcissists is hardly news, but that we are behaving like 2-year-olds, maybe even being programmed into mental illness like schizophrenia, is more shocking. When our worlds disappear, then also disappear what certainties we once held dear. For we all are now cast into a world of uncertainty over which we have no control. We all deep down now realise that not only do we have no control over those plotting our fate, but aren't even entirely sure who these people are. So all we can do is live each day as though it were our last, and thank God that he provided us for this opportunity to walk on his earth. But what if those plotting against us and their acts are our own dark sides? Can we remove them through exploring our own good? Well, that concludes this chapter from my fourth book, The Phoenix and the Creatures of Darkness. And it's actually the final in this series of books. I'm not saying I won't write another book, but I feel this series is now complete. I really hoped you enjoyed it. And now I'm going to add a new chapter every week to this book. So if you want to hear about it, subscribe and hit the bell. Now, I'm not doing particularly well with these eBay, YouTube algorithms. So if you could hit the like button and make some comments, I think it helps me. I hate to ask you for this. I hate it when I hear people coming out with this sort of statement. But the truth is that this has been like a full-time job for the last 4 years of my life. And I'm still a long way off from receiving any money whatsoever for it. So I really do need to, I suppose, beg you. Subscribe, like, make comments. And thank you very much. Thanks.